Come, boy, it's only a film. Come. Pull yourself together. Now, a few dollars, eh? That'll get your head up. Come on, money.
John Lennon was undoubtedly one of the most important figures in rock music history. As a member of the Beatles, and later as a solo artist, he influenced countless musicians and fans around the world. However, despite his fame and talent, not everyone in the music industry appreciated him. His outspoken political views, artistic choices, and sometimes difficult personality led to several conflicts with other prominent musicians. These disagreements ranged from political differences to personal betrayals, and some of these feuds became quite public. Elvis Presley, a meeting gone wrong. The relationship between Elvis Presley and John Lennon represents one of the most fascinating conflicts in rock history. Both men were giants in their field, but their only face-to-face meeting in 1965 revealed deep differences that would shape their relationship for years to come. The meeting was arranged by Chris Hutchins, a music journalist and publicist who thought it would be wonderful for the Beatles to meet their idol, Elvis Presley. The Beatles had always spoken highly of Elvis and considered him a major influence on their music. However, when Lennon entered Presley's Los Angeles mansion, tensions began almost immediately. The main source of conflict was their completely different political views, particularly regarding the Vietnam War. Lennon was a committed pacifist who strongly opposed the war, while Presley was deeply patriotic and supportive of the American government. The tension became obvious when Lennon noticed some table lamps in Presley's home that were shaped like covered wagons. Each lamp was engraved with the phrase, "All the way with Lyndon B. Johnson," which was a slogan supporting President Johnson's administration and his aggressive military policies in Vietnam. Lennon couldn't help but express his anti-war views when he saw these lamps. This did not go over well with Presley, who felt that Lennon was being disrespectful to his country and his president. What should have been a historic meeting between two of the greatest musicians of all time instead became an uncomfortable and tense encounter. Hutchins later remembered that Presley was clearly annoyed by Lennon's outspoken pacifism, and this set the stage for years of resentment between the two men. The bad feelings from this meeting didn't fade away. In fact, Presley's dislike of Lennon actually grew stronger over time. By 1971, Presley had become so concerned about what he saw as Lennon's negative influence on American youth that he decided to take action. He arranged a meeting with J. Edgar Hoover, the powerful and controversial director of the FBI. During this meeting, Presley expressed his belief that Lennon and the Beatles had contributed to what he saw as moral decay among young people. He complained about their filthy, unkempt appearances and what he considered to be suggestive music. Presley also accused them of encouraging youth rebellion, drug culture, and anti-government feelings among American teenagers. This wasn't just a casual conversation between Presley and the FBI director. Presley was seriously trying to convince the government to take action against Lennon. At the time, Lennon was facing immigration problems as he and his wife Yoko Ono were trying to get permanent residency in the United States. His anti-war activism and opposition to President Nixon's administration had already made him a target for government surveillance. Presley's support for these concerns likely played a role in increasing the pressure that federal authorities put on Lennon during this period. Bob Dylan. Influence and imitation. The relationship between Bob Dylan and John Lennon was complex and built on a mixture of admiration, influence, and eventually rivalry. In the early years of the Beatles, Lennon was fascinated by Dylan's poetic and introspective songwriting style. Dylan had the ability to write deeply personal and meaningful lyrics, which was very different from the catchy but often simple love songs that dominated the Beatles' early music. Inspired by Dylan's storytelling approach, Lennon began incorporating more thoughtful and intimate lyrics into his own songs. This influence can be heard in some of his most beloved compositions, including In My Life and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. These songs showed a more mature and reflective side of Lennon's writing that hadn't been present in the Beatles' earlier work. However, While Lennon was deeply influenced by Dylan, the admiration wasn't completely mutual. Dylan, who was known for his rebellious spirit and sharp wit, wasn't particularly happy about the idea that Lennon had borrowed from his style. Rather than seeing it as flattery, Dylan viewed it as imitation. By the mid-1960s, Dylan had already established himself as a counterculture icon, and he wasn't keen on sharing that position with the Beatles, who, despite their increasing artistic depth, were still seen as pop superstars rather than underground poets. The tension between them became more obvious in 1965 when the Beatles released Rubber Soul. It was clear that Dylan's influence was all over this album. One song in particular, Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, was a standout track that showed Lennon's growing interest in narrative-driven, folk-inspired songwriting. The song's acoustic, storytelling nature felt very much like something Dylan might have written himself, and this apparently bothered Dylan quite a bit. In 1966, Dylan delivered what many saw as a response to Lennon's imitation. He released a song called Fourth Time Around on his legendary album Blonde on Blonde. This track was a barely disguised parody of Norwegian Wood, copying its melody structure and lyrical themes, but with a cynical and almost mocking tone. Dylan's lyrics painted a bizarre, detached conversation between two people with an underlying feeling of sarcasm and resentment. The similarities between the two songs were too obvious to be accidental, making it clear that Dylan was sending a pointed message to Lennon. To make his point even clearer, Dylan didn't just release the song publicly. He reportedly played it for Lennon in person. This moment must have been deeply uncomfortable for Lennon, who, despite his own sharp tongue, was now the target of Dylan's poetic mockery. Lennon was reportedly disturbed by the experience, unsure whether the song was meant as a joke or a direct attack. Though he never explicitly confirmed his feelings about Fourth Time Around, some accounts suggest that he left the encounter feeling shaken, realizing that the admiration he had for Dylan was not fully returned. Steely Dan. Criticizing the Dreamer. In the early 1970s, John Lennon's song Imagine became one of the most famous and controversial songs of its time. Many people praised it as an anthem for peace and unity, but it also drew sharp criticism from those who viewed its utopian vision as naive, impractical, or even hypocritical. Among the harshest critics were Steely Dan, the sharp-tongued, jazz-influenced rock duo of Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. Steely Dan was known for their cynical, almost satirical approach to songwriting, and they took direct aim at Lennon's idealism with a song called Only a Fool Would Say That, from their 1972 debut album Can't Buy a Thrill. At the heart of Steely Dan's criticism was their belief that Lennon's campaign for world peace. He was not only unrealistic, but also disconnected from the struggles of everyday people. While Lennon presented himself as a revolutionary figure calling for a world without borders, religion, or material wealth, Steely Dan saw a contradiction between his message and his lifestyle. To them, Lennon's calls for a utopian society rang hollow when they came from a man who lived in an expensive mansion, played a grand Steinway piano, and enjoyed all the privileges of rock star wealth. Only a Fool Would Say That is filled with sarcasm, with its laid-back groove and deceptively easy melody, hiding the biting cynicism underneath. The lyrics suggest that only someone removed from reality, someone living in a world of wealth and comfort, could afford to believe in the kind of dream Lennon was selling. Donald Fagen's smooth vocal delivery reinforced the idea that Lennon's vision was little more than a fantasy, something that might sound appealing but would crumble when faced with real-world complexities. Steely Dan weren't the only musicians to challenge Lennon's peace and love philosophy. Frank Zappa, another outspoken figure of the era, was equally skeptical of Lennon's approach. Zappa, known for his irreverent wit and sharp social commentary, saw Lennon's activism as performative, a way to maintain relevance rather than a genuine effort to create change. While Zappa and Lennon briefly collaborated on stage in 1971, their different worldviews became apparent. Zappa, a fierce individualist, was wary of slogans and movements that seemed to oversimplify complex social issues. Even Lennon himself wasn't completely blind to such criticism. As Imagine became one of his defining works, he acknowledged its contradictions. In interviews, he admitted that the song's message was aspirational, rather than reflective of his own lifestyle. He and Yoko Ono may have used their platform to promote peace, but they still lived comfortably, surrounded by the benefits of success. Lee Nonon later reflected on his role in the counterculture, admitting that he, like everyone else, was flawed and figuring things out as he went along. Todd Rundgren, questioning sincerity. During the early 1970s, Todd Rundgren was enjoying considerable musical success with a series of hits that became essential parts of the era's pop and progressive rock landscape. Songs like Hello, It's Me and I Saw the Light demonstrated his ability to create catchy melodies and complex arrangements, earning him a reputation as a studio wizard and a pop visionary. However, while his songwriting showed clear influences from the Beatles, particularly their later, more experimental work, Rundgren was not one to praise John Lennon. In fact, he was openly critical of Lennon's post-Beatles career, especially his public activism and revolutionary rhetoric. As Lennon ventured into his solo career, his music took a more introspective and political turn. Albums like Plastic Ono Band, 1970, and Imagine, 1971, reflected both personal struggles and broader social issues. Songs such as Working Class Hero and Give Me Some Truth positioned Lennon as a voice for the counterculture, while his relationship with Yoko Ono further transformed him into a global peace advocate. However, not everyone was convinced by his sincerity, and Todd Rundgren was among the skeptics. Rundgren saw Lennon's political outspokenness as a self-serving pursuit rather than a genuine call for change. In a 1974 interview with Melody Maker, he dismissed Lennon's activism, suggesting that the ex-Beatle was less interested in making a real difference and more concerned with keeping the spotlight on himself. All he really wants to do is get attention for himself, Rundgren remarked. And if revolution gets him that attention, he'll get attention through revolution. These harsh words painted Lennon as a publicity seeker rather than a true revolutionary, implying that his peace campaigns and social stances were merely part of a larger performance designed to maintain his fame and relevance. Not surprisingly, Lennon did not take Rundgren's criticism quietly. Known for his sharp wit and unfiltered opinions, he fired back with a response that was both defensive and dismissive. In an open letter to Rundgren, Lennon rejected the idea that he represented anything other than his own beliefs. "I don't represent anyone but myself," he countered. "It sounds like I represented something to you, or you wouldn't be so violent towards me." This response not only pushed back against Rundgren's accusations, but also suggested that Rundgren's words were more reflective of personal resentment than objective criticism. The clash between Rundgren and Lennon was more than just an exchange of harsh words. It reflected a broader divide in the music world regarding the role of artists in political discourse. While some, like Lennon, believed that musicians had a responsibility to use their platform for activism, others, like Rundgren, were skeptical of such efforts, particularly when they came from figures as famous and influential as the Beatles' former frontman, Joni Mitchell. Unsolicited advice. Joni Mitchell and John Lennon were two of the most influential singer-songwriters of their era, each redefining the landscape of music in their own way. Mitchell, with her deeply introspective and poetic lyricism, became a folk icon, while Lennon, both as a Beatle and a solo artist, was a defining voice of a generation. However, despite their shared status as musical pioneers, the two didn't see eye to eye. Their encounters were marked by tension, and an underlying friction developed between them, fueled in part by Lennon's unsolicited criticism of Mitchell's Amud. 6. By the early 1970s, Joni Mitchell had established herself as one of the most unique voices in folk and rock. With albums like Ladies of the Canyon, (1970) and Blue (1971), she redefined what singer-songwriters could achieve, weaving personal, deeply emotional storytelling into her music. Her work on Blue was particularly groundbreaking, offering an unguarded look into heartbreak, personal growth, and the raw complexities of love and loss. It was a record unlike anything that had come before, influencing countless artists across generations. Lennon, on the other hand, had taken a different path after the Beatles. By the time Blue was released, he had already issued Plastic Ono Band, 1970, and Imagine, 1971, both of which showcased his own brand of introspection. However, his approach was often raw and confrontational, but rarely as poetically delicate as Mitchell's work. Though both artists were deeply personal in their music, they approached songwriting in different ways. Mitchell's songs often unfolded like intricate narratives filled with rich imagery and complex emotions, whereas Lennon's writing, particularly in his solo years, was often more direct and slogan-like. Their personalities and artistic philosophies were bound to clash, and when they did cross paths, their impressions of one another were less than favorable. The heart of their feud can be traced to an incident where Lennon offered Mitchell some unsolicited advice about her music, advice she neither asked for nor appreciated. While the specific details of his critique remain unclear, Mitchell deeply resented Lennon's condescending attitude. Given his history of being blunt and sometimes tactless in his opinions, it's likely that his feedback was less than diplomatic. Mitchell, known for her independence and artistic integrity, wasn't one to take criticism lightly, especially from someone who, in her view, didn't fully understand her approach to music. Lennon's dismissive attitude toward folk artists was well documented. He had at times shown little patience for the introspective nature of singer-songwriters, and his tendency to be outspoken, even cutting, may have further worsened the tension between them. Mitchell later expressed her own frustrations with Lennon, and in a rare instance of public criticism, she made it clear that she didn't hold him in the highest regard. While many in the music world idolized Lennon, she saw past the mythology and found him to be flawed, perhaps even hypocritical in some ways. In her eyes, his activism and public persona didn't always align with his actions, and she wasn't afraid to voice that opinion. Frank Zappa. The Theft of King Kong. Frank Zappa and John Lennon were both groundbreaking musicians who pushed the boundaries of rock music in their own ways. Yet their brief collaboration in 1971 ended in controversy and disappointment. Zappa, known for his avant-garde approach to rock and his sharp, no-nonsense personality, was highly critical of Lennon, not for his music, but for what he saw as an act of outright theft. Their falling out stemmed from a single night on stage at the Fillmore East, where Lennon and Yoko Ono joined Zappa and his band, the Mothers of Invention, for an impromptu jam session. What should have been a unique and exciting crossover between two iconic artists instead turned into a bitter dispute over credit and ownership. The performance took place on June 6, 1971, during one of Zappa's shows at the Fillmore East in New York City. Lennon, who was exploring new musical directions after Imagine, had recently befriended Zappa and admired his experimental approach, looking for something fresh and unconventional. Lennon and Ono took the stage with Zappa and his band, joining them in a free-form jam session that included several pieces, one of which was King Kong, a well-established Zappa composition that he had been performing since the late 1960s. At the time, everything seemed friendly enough. The jam was an energetic, unstructured experiment that blended Zappa's intricate instrumental arrangements with Lennon and Ono's improvisational vocalizations. Lennon was particularly drawn to the chaotic, almost absurdist nature of the performance, which aligned with his post-Beatles interest in pushing musical boundaries. However, the goodwill didn't last long. When Lennon released Sometime in New York City in 1972, the live recording from that night was included on the album. The problem was that the track King Kong was renamed Jam Rag, and Zappa received no credit for writing it. Instead, the song was credited to Lennon and Ono, making it appear as if it was their own original composition. For Zappa, this wasn't just an oversight, it was theft. Zappa didn't hold back his frustration when discussing the issue in later interviews. He made it clear that he felt Lennon had taken advantage of him, stating, "John just took the master tapes and put it out as if it were his own. I don't have anything against him personally, but that was a really cheap thing to do." For an artist as fiercely independent as Zappa, this was more than just a matter of credit. It was about artistic integrity. Zappa had built his career on pushing against the mainstream music industry, refusing to compromise his vision, and standing up for musicians' rights. Seeing Lennon, someone he might have otherwise respected, appropriate his work without permission or acknowledgement was a serious betrayal. To make matters worse, the album's production choices added further insult to injury. Zappa had his own version of the performance, which he later released on his album Playground Psychotics in 1992. Unlike Lennon's version, which had been heavily edited and remixed, Zappa's release preserved the raw, unaltered recording of the jam session. His version made it clear that King Kong was his song and exposed how much Lennon had manipulated the material for his own release. This incident left a permanent stain on Zappa's view of Lennon. While he didn't hold a personal grudge, he never forgot the experience and remained critical of Lennon's handling of the situation. The irony, of course, is that Lennon had spent much of his post-Beatles career advocating for honesty, peace, and artistic freedom. Yet here he was, seemingly disregarding those very principles when it came to another artist's work. Conclusion: these conflicts reveal a different side of John Lennon than the peace-loving activist many people remember. While he was undoubtedly a talented musician and an important cultural figure, he was also human, with all the flaws and contradictions that come with that. His outspoken political views, sometimes abrasive personality, and occasional lack of consideration for others led to several significant conflicts with fellow musicians. From Elvis Presley's political disagreements to Frank Zappa's accusations of theft, these disputes show that even the most celebrated artists can have serious personal and professional conflicts. They remind us that the music industry, like any other field, is filled with complex personalities and competing egos. These stories don't diminish Lennon's contributions to music and culture, but they do provide a more complete picture of who he was as a person and an artist.